Okay, well, everyone, thanks for coming. We should probably get started here. Our slideshow tonight is on... Hi, no, that's okay. Come on in. Help yourself to the popcorn and the Cokes in the fridge. So the slideshow tonight is on the Chilkoot Trail, a trip that my brother Stan and I and a bunch of his friends took back in 1975. So we start by driving from Anchorage to Haines, Alaska, which is about 608 miles, and you actually drive through part of Canada in order to get there. So just a little reminder here for those who may not know, the Chilkoot Trail was one of the access routes to the Klondike Gold Rush back in 1896. The land portion of the journey for the wannabe miners over the mountains to the headwaters of the Yukon begins in Skagway. For our journey to get from Haines, Alaska to Skagway, just for grins, we decided to fly. We begin this hike at the trailhead along the coast near the mouth of the Daia River. From the start of the trailhead and through the Daia River Valley, up over the mountaintops and then down to Lake Bennett, it would be 33 miles. For us, it would be fun. For the miners in the stampede, it would be fraught with danger. Let's see. Typhoid, meningitis, scurvy, avalanches, drowning, violence. Oh my. On our return trip from Lake Bennett down to Skagway, we would ride the famed White Pass Railway, a narrow gauge track system chiseled out of the steep mountainsides of White Pass. Along the trail in 1975, there were placards installed noting points of interest and historical events that took place in those areas. Yep, way back in those days, the idea of the ultralight hiker hadn't quite evolved yet. Worse yet, if you were to transition back another 75 years back to the 1890s, the amount of gear that those miners took with them is measured on a scale of tonnage. You see, the Canadian Mounties back then were the law of the land, and they didn't favor much the idea of several thousand people dying off during their cold, harsh winters. So the law was you would not be allowed to enter the Canadian territories unless you had with you 1,000 pounds of provisions to get you through the winter. The trail up to about the 8-mile mark is pretty level, but things are about to incline pretty quickly as we enter an area called Canyon City. In as little as 3 years, upwards of 100,000 people would be trying to make their way up to the Klondike. Most of those stampeders would choose the Chilkoot route. The other route coming out of Skagway that the stampeders were taking was the lower altitude White Pass route. These stampeders loaded up barges coming out of San Francisco and Seattle with pack animals. So taking pack animals to carry all that gear over a lower altitude pass certainly seems the reasonable way to go. So thousands of people taking thousands of horses, making multiple trips carrying thousands of pounds over a temperate rainforest trail turned out to be a bad idea. Robert Service, having personally witnessed the carnage of 3,000 sick and dying horses, coined the phrase the Dead Horse Trail. So for both trail systems, a better option for getting thousands of people over the passes had to be derived. For White Pass, the engineering option of choice was a rail system. For the Chilkoot, it was multiple series of cable tram systems. Those lines going up the mountains are people, standing single file, each waiting for the person in front of them to take one step at a time. With packs on upwards to 150 pounds, carrying 1,000 pounds of provisions, that's about 8 to 10 times up the scales. Thick with brush, thick with boulders, and rising over 3,000 feet from Sheep Camp to the top of the scales, the Chilkoot presents an ever-increasing slope of ascent. Seems to me, if I remember right, one of the girls we were with, while climbing up the scales, the snow broke out from underneath her and she fell into the creek below. She would have a difficult time making it to the top, but just the same, we cooked up some hot beverages and took a break, and she got into some drier clothes. The top of the scales is really fantastic. It's like an open-air museum. Amongst the rocks, we would find trash scattered about that we would otherwise call artifacts. Of the discarded items, you would find boots, clothes, tin cans, rusted shovels, all preserved to a remarkable degree by the frozen climate. The top of the scales is about 16 miles in from the beginning of the trailhead. It's also the halfway point, and it's the Alaska-US-Canadian border boundary. I did not find a name for this glacier at the top of the scales. According to geology, in order to be classified as a glacier, the ice has to be moving. Clearly, this ice is moving ice. After reaching the top of the scales at about 3,500 feet, we will then begin to descend about 500 feet to a high plateau of little pockets of lakes and standing ice. After you get over this little rise, you will descend down into an area called Happy Camp, and there you will probably find it a little easier to set up some kind of a shelter if you have to get warm. And a little farther down the trail is Carter Lake. In present day, there are campsites established at comfortable distances along the Chilkoot Trail on both the Alaska-US side and the Canadian side. At the campsites of present day, you can expect to find fresh water provided for you. There's also a gray water disposal site and level wooden platforms for pitching your tent. Of course, in 1975, the campsites didn't have the amenities that they do these days, but certainly campsites were well established. Once you drop down to about the 2,000 foot level on the Canadian side of the border, you enter a boreal forest, which typically is a little bit drier and has smaller trees. After having set up camp and had a chance to relax a bit, you are definitely encouraged to get out into the woods and explore and look around a bit. There are still plenty of interesting things and artifacts hanging around. Naturally, when you do find something of interest laying about, you are expected to leave it in place for others to see. And yet, It is with a little bit of irony that with the international mantra of LNT, leave no trace, that we go out exploring in the woods looking for things like rusted tin cans. Oh, that's nice. The Pacific dogwood flower on Canadian soil, showing its appreciation to its neighbor to the west. There's two other lakes that the trail goes by in this area before one reaches Lake Lindeman and Lake Bennett. The first lake would be Long Lake, and it isn't very long. And the second lake would be Deep Lake, and I didn't check that out. Nonetheless, the water has a beautiful light-toned jade color to it. Lake Lindeman and Lake Bennett are areas where the huge Klondike Gold Rush traffic jam pileup occurred. The reason being is you had to be the first to find the gold and stake a claim to it. And one of the big things that stands in your way from being able to do that is ice. The miners needed to set up a winter camp, preferably by the beach. They needed access to trees not only for firewood, but also to build boats and rafts. The plan was they were going to float the 500 miles on the Yukon River up towards Bonanza Creek. Within the first 3 weeks of the ice having gone out that spring, over 20,000 people on 7,000 rafts and boats were trying to float the Yukon. Some miners leaving Lake Lindeman didn't even make it to Lake Bennett. The short series of rapids between the two was enough to destroy some boats and rafts and provisions. The Chilkoot Trail terminates at Lake Bennett, and for us, the Chilkoot Trail certainly has lived up to its promise of delivering beauty and drama. But the fun isn't over for us just yet. We still have the thrill of riding on the White Pass narrow gauge railway.